The family meeting was held in Uncle Richard's oak-paneled study, the same room where he'd announced every major family decision for the past 20 years. 15 adults sat in leather chairs arranged in a semicircle, all summoned to discuss Grandpa William's estate planning. The will reading wasn't scheduled for months, but Richard wanted to clarify expectations about inheritance distribution. I sat in the back row, notepad in hand, watching my adoptive family discuss my financial future without particularly caring about my input. This wasn't unusual. In the 12 years since Mom and Dad had adopted me at age 16, family financial discussions had always carried an unspoken understanding that certain benefits were reserved for real family members. Grandpa William worked his entire life to build wealth for his bloodline, Uncle Richard announced from behind his massive mahogany desk. The wall behind him displayed framed photos of 3 generations of family businesses, construction companies, manufacturing plants, and real estate developments that had made the family name synonymous with success in our Ohio industrial town. The inheritance should reflect biological relationships, Richard continued. Blood relatives who carry the family name and the family genes. That's what Grandpa would have wanted. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Aunt Patricia nodded firmly. Cousin Michael leaned forward in approval. Even my adoptive parents, Mom and Dad, remained silent rather than challenge the family patriarch. Now, I'm not saying adoption isn't meaningful, Richard clarified, glancing in my direction. Jennifer has been a wonderful addition to our family. But financial inheritance is different. It's about passing wealth to the next generation of biological descendants. More nods. I wrote biological descendants only in my notepad and underlined it twice. The estate is valued at approximately $47 million, Richard announced. I propose dividing it equally among Grandpa's 6 biological grandchildren: Michael, David, Sarah, Rebecca, Thomas, and Catherine. That's roughly $7.8 million each. I did the math automatically. 6 biological grandchildren, $47 million. No provision for the one adoptive grandchild who'd been calling William Grandpa for over a decade. What about Jennifer? Dad asked quietly. His voice carried the careful tone of someone who wanted to advocate for their child without causing family conflict. Richard's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine compassion. Jennifer will always be family in every way that matters emotionally. But adopted kids don't get family money. That's just how inheritance works. Blood relatives only. The room was silent for a moment. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd react to being financially excluded from the family I'd been part of since high school. I completely understand, I said, closing my notepad. That makes perfect sense. Relief was visible on several faces. Richard smiled approvingly. I'm glad you're being so mature about this, Jennifer. It shows real character. Thank you, I replied. I appreciate you being direct about family financial priorities. The meeting continued for another hour, covering details about trust structures, tax implications, and timeline considerations. I listened politely, occasionally asking clarifying questions about procedures and legal requirements. My finance background made me useful for technical discussions, even if I wasn't benefiting from the decisions being made. After the meeting ended, several family members approached me with expressions of sympathy mixed with relief. You're handling this really well, Cousin Sarah said, squeezing my shoulder. I know it must be disappointing, but you understand why bloodlines matter for inheritance. Of course, I agreed. Family money should stay with family genes. Michael joined our conversation. Exactly. Plus, you've got your accounting career. You're not dependent on family wealth like some of us who went into the family businesses. I nodded thoughtfully. Michael managed one of the family's construction companies. His brother David ran the real estate division. Most of my biological cousins had built their careers within the family business ecosystem, supported by capital from previous generations. It's different when you're self-made, I said. I've never relied on family money for anything. That's what makes you so strong, Aunt Patricia added. You've built your own independent life. Independent. Self-made. Strong. The family had always used these words to describe my situation, and I'd never corrected their assumptions about what my independent life actually looked like. Tuesday morning, I sat in my downtown office reviewing the financial documents I'd brought home from Richard's meeting. Midwest Manufacturing Corporation was prominently mentioned throughout the estate planning materials. It was the crown jewel of Grandpa Williams' business empire, the company that had generated much of the family's wealth over the past 30 years. I opened my secure investment management platform and navigated to my portfolio overview. Total assets under management, $1.2 billion. Personal net worth, $580 million. The numbers represented 15 years of strategic investing, beginning with a modest inheritance from my biological grandmother and growing through carefully calculated risks in emerging markets. I located the Midwest Manufacturing holdings within my portfolio. The investment was structured through 4 different shell companies to maintain anonymity. Pinnacle Capital Holdings 22%, Strategic Growth Partners 18%, Industrial Innovation Fund 15%, and Legacy Investment Group 12%. Combined, these entities controlled 67% of Midwest Manufacturing Corporation. Uncle Richard had no idea that his company's largest shareholder was the adopted niece he'd just excluded from family financial benefits. I picked up my secure phone and called Harrison Wells, my investment manager at Blackstone Capital. Harrison, I need to liquidate the Midwest Manufacturing positions. All 4 shell companies, complete withdrawal. Jennifer, that's a substantial position. $180 million in invested capital, plus you're the controlling shareholder. Complete withdrawal will destabilize the company significantly. I understand the implications. May I ask what's driving this decision? Midwest Manufacturing has been one of our strongest performers. Revenue growth, expanding market share, solid management team. I looked out my office window at the city skyline. Several buildings in the downtown area had been constructed by family companies, their signs bearing the family name that I shared through adoption but apparently not through financial inheritance rights. The investment no longer aligns with my values, I said. I see. How do you want to structure the withdrawal? We could phase it over several quarters to minimize market disruption. No. I want immediate liquidation. Today. Harrison was quiet for a moment. Jennifer, immediate withdrawal of $180 million will create severe cash flow problems for Midwest Manufacturing. They'll likely need emergency financing within days, possibly bankruptcy protection within weeks. That's their responsibility to manage. It's also going to impact every employee at the company. Midwest Manufacturing employs over 400 people. I considered this information carefully. 400 jobs. Many of them held by people who'd worked for the company for decades. People who'd contributed to the success that made my uncle wealthy enough to distribute $47 million to his biological grandchildren. Harrison, what percentage of Midwest Manufacturing's workforce would you estimate earns less than $50,000 annually? Probably 60 to 70%. It's a manufacturing company, lots of floor workers, equipment operators, administrative staff. And what percentage of the family members inheriting from Grandpa Williams' estate work directly in the family businesses? I'm not sure I understand the connection. Humor me. Harrison paused while he thought. Based on what you've told me about your family structure, probably most of them. Your cousins manage various divisions, your uncle oversees operations. They're all drawing salaries from companies that your investment portfolio has been supporting. So when I withdraw my funding, the people most likely to lose their jobs are the employees who weren't invited to family inheritance meetings, while the people who will receive $7.8 million each are the same people who could find alternative employment within the family business network. That's an interesting way to analyze it. Proceed with the withdrawal, I said. Complete liquidation effective immediately. The first phone call came at 2:47 p.m. Uncle Richard's name appeared on my phone screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Jennifer, I need to speak with you immediately. Something's happening at the company and I think there might be some kind of coordinated attack on our investors. Call me back as soon as you get this. The second call came at 3:23 p.m., this time from cousin Michael. Hey, not sure if you've heard, but Dad's company is having some kind of financial crisis. Major investors are pulling out and he's panicking. Since you work in finance, I thought maybe you could help us understand what's happening. Call me back. By 4:30 p.m., I had 12 missed calls from various family members and a text message from Mom. Richard is asking if you know anything about investment firms. He thinks someone is targeting the family businesses. Please call him back. At 5:15 p.m., Harrison called to update me on the withdrawal status. It's done, he said. All positions liquidated, funds transferred to your primary accounts. Midwest Manufacturing's stock price dropped 43% in the last 2 hours of trading. They're calling emergency board meetings and reaching out to alternative funding sources. Any immediate operational impacts? Their CFO announced they're suspending all expansion projects and implementing a hiring freeze. They'll probably announce layoffs within the week if they can't secure replacement funding. What about management compensation? That information isn't public, but typically executive salaries are protected longer than line worker positions during financial crises. I hung up and drove home to my modest apartment. I'd deliberately chosen to live below my means, maintaining the appearance of someone who worked a steady accounting job rather than someone who managed nearly $1 billion in assets. The deception had been useful for observing my family's true attitudes about adoption, biological relationships, and financial inclusion. Wednesday morning brought 17 missed calls overnight. I listened to the voicemails while drinking coffee in my kitchen. Richard's voice had progressed from confusion to panic to desperation. The final message, left at 2:33 a.m., was barely coherent. Jennifer, I don't know what we did to deserve this, but someone is destroying everything our family built. Please, if you have any connections in the finance world, we need help. We're going to lose everything. At 8:30 a.m. my doorbell rang. Through the peephole I could see Uncle Richard standing in my hallway. He looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight, disheveled hair, rumpled clothing, eyes red from stress and sleeplessness. I opened the door. Thank God you're here, he said, pushing past me into my apartment. I've been calling you for hours. I was sleeping, I said, closing the door. What's going on? Richard collapsed onto my couch, holding his head in his hands. Someone is destroying our company. Our major investors, all of them, pulled out yesterday. $180 million, gone. Just like that. I sat across from him in my second-hand armchair. That sounds terrible. It gets worse. Without that funding we can't make payroll next month. We can't fulfill our existing contracts. We can't maintain our equipment. The bank is already calling about loan guarantees. What do the other family members think is happening? Michael thinks it's a competitor trying to force a hostile takeover. David thinks it might be related to some regulatory investigation. Patricia thinks it's just bad luck, market forces. What do you think? Richard looked up at me with exhausted eyes. I think someone found out about our estate planning meeting and decided to punish us for it. I kept my expression neutral. Why would anyone care about your estate planning? Because someone doesn't like how we're handling the inheritance. Someone thinks adopted kids should get family money, and they're using financial warfare to make their point. That seems like a very elaborate way to express disagreement about inheritance law. Unless, Richard said slowly, the person disagreeing has the resources to do something about it. We sat in silence for several minutes. Richard continued, holding his head in his hands while I processed the implications of his statement. Richard, I said finally, what would you do if you discovered that the investments keeping your company afloat were coming from someone you'd excluded from family financial benefits? He looked up sharply. What kind of question is that? A hypothetical one. If you found out that an adopted family member had been anonymously supporting the family businesses for years, and then withdrew that support after being told that adopted kids don't get family money, how would you react? Richard's face went pale. Jennifer, why are you asking me this? I stood up and retrieved my laptop from my desk. I opened my investment portfolio dashboard and turned the screen toward Richard. Because I want to know if your position on biological inheritance extends to biological investment, I said. Richard stared at the screen for a long moment, his eyes scanning the numbers. Total portfolio value, $1.2 billion. Midwest Manufacturing Holdings, $0, liquidated. Transaction history showing yesterday's complete withdrawal. This says you had $180 million invested in my company, he whispered. Had. Past tense. You're the major investor. You're the one who pulled out. I'm the adopted family member who decided that if adopted kids don't get family money, then family businesses don't get adopted kids' money. Richard set my laptop aside and looked at me directly. Jennifer, I had no idea you had this kind of wealth. I know. If I had known, the inheritance discussion would have been completely different. Would it? Richard was quiet for a moment. Honestly, probably not. I still believe that biological inheritance should follow bloodlines. But I would have been more diplomatic about excluding you. More diplomatic. Not more inclusive, just more diplomatic. Well, yes. If I had known you controlled the funding that keeps our company operational, I would have approached the conversation differently. I nodded slowly. So your position isn't that adopted kids don't deserve family money. Your position is that adopted kids don't deserve family money unless they have enough independent wealth to threaten family businesses. Richard's face flushed. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? I meant that inheritance should be based on biological relationships, but business relationships are different. If you're an investor in our company, that's a separate matter from family inheritance. Except that I became an investor because I'm a family member. I supported Midwest manufacturing because I wanted my adoptive family to succeed. But you never told us about your investments. Because I wanted to see how you'd treat an adopted family member who you thought had nothing to offer you financially. Richard stood up and began pacing around my small living room. This is a very expensive way to make a point about inclusion. It's a very expensive lesson about respect. What do you want from me, Jennifer? An apology? A change to the inheritance structure? What would it take for you to reinvest in the company? I considered his question carefully. Richard was asking what price I would accept for restoring funding to a business that employed 400 people, including many who'd worked there for decades. I want you to understand why I withdrew my investment, I said. Because we excluded you from the inheritance. Because you excluded me while assuming I had nothing valuable to contribute to the family's financial future. Richard stopped pacing. I don't understand the distinction. Richard, you spent 15 years watching me work in finance, watching me make strategic decisions, watching me provide practical advice during family financial discussions. Did it ever occur to you that someone with my background might have investment capacity? Not to this extent, no. Did it occur to you that someone might be helping fund the family businesses anonymously? No. Did you consider that your adopted niece might have deliberately maintained a modest lifestyle to observe how the family treated people they perceived as financially dependent? Richard sat back down on my couch. No. None of that occurred to me. So when you announced that adopted kids don't get family money, you weren't just excluding me from inheritance. You were demonstrating that you'd never considered me capable of contributing to family wealth. I suppose that's true. Which means that your decision wasn't really about biological versus adopted relationships. It was about assuming that adopted family members are financial burdens rather than financial assets. Richard was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. Finally he spoke. What happens now? To the company, I mean. To the employees. That depends on what you've learned from this experience. I've learned that making assumptions about people's financial capacity can have serious consequences. What else? I've learned that adopted family members might have resources and capabilities that biological family members don't recognize. And Richard thought for another moment. I've learned that treating family members as lesser because of their adoption status is not only morally wrong, but potentially financially catastrophic. I opened my laptop again and pulled up a new document. I'm willing to consider reinvestment in Midwest manufacturing under new terms. What kind of terms? First, I want equal representation in family financial discussions. If you're making decisions that affect family businesses, I want input as a major stakeholder. Agreed. Second, I want the inheritance structure revised to include adopted family members. Not necessarily equal distribution, but meaningful inclusion. Richard hesitated. The other family members might object to changing Grandpa Williams' intended inheritance plan. Then you can explain to them that Grandpa Williams' intended inheritance plan was built on wealth generated by companies that I've been funding for years. Point taken. What else? Third, I want transparency. No more assumptions about who has money and who doesn't. No more exclusions based on perceived financial status. Understood. I typed up a preliminary agreement and showed it to Richard. $150 million in reinvestment, structured as a formal partnership rather than anonymous funding. You keep operational control, I get board representation and quarterly financial reviews. Richard read through the terms carefully. This is actually better than our previous funding structure. More capital, clearer governance, better oversight. It's what happens when you treat family members as partners rather than burdens. Richard signed the agreement, then looked up at me. Jennifer, I owe you an apology. Not just for yesterday's meeting, but for 15 years of treating you like someone who needed family support rather than someone who was providing it. Apology accepted. And I need to call an emergency family meeting to discuss revising the inheritance structure. That would be appropriate. Richard gathered his papers and headed toward my door. At the threshold, he turned back. One more question. When you said you completely understand our position on biological inheritance, did you mean that, or were you already planning this withdrawal? I smiled. I meant that I completely understood your position. I just didn't agree with it. Over the next month, I watched the family dynamics shift as everyone processed the new reality. The inheritance structure was revised to include a substantial provision for adopted family members. Family business discussions began, including input from previously overlooked relatives. Most importantly, the assumption that adoption status correlated with financial dependence was permanently corrected. Midwest manufacturing recovered stronger than before, with better capitalization and more diverse leadership. The 400 employees kept their jobs, and several new positions were created as the company expanded into markets I'd identified through my investment research. But the most significant change was in how the family discussed success and contribution. The narrative shifted from biological inheritance rights to inclusive prosperity, from protecting family wealth to growing family wealth through everyone's capabilities. 6 months later, at Grandpa William's actual will reading, Richard stood up before the final distribution. Before we conclude, he said, I want to acknowledge that this family's financial success has been built not just on biological inheritance, but on the contributions of every family member, including those who joined us through adoption. Our strength comes from recognizing everyone's value, not from excluding people based on how they became part of our family. The revised inheritance distributed $47 million among 8 family members rather than 6, with adopted grandchildren receiving equal shares as biological ones. But more importantly, it established a precedent that family money belongs to family members regardless of genetics. Blood might be thicker than water, but shared values and mutual respect are thicker than blood.